Okay, so we'll share the screen, just an introduction to the introduction. The main parsha, the main point of the parsha is the mitzvahs of Shemitah and Yovel, which is the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, and the other economic results of that Shemitah system, the Jubilee system, sale of land, sale of also in some cases, sale of movable property, sale also in some cases of if somebody becomes a servant and sells himself as a slave, the laws of redeeming him, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot about the economic system in biblical Israel as it was laid out in the vision of God in the Torah. Some of this does not apply today, as we will get into, but certainly the values behind this should definitely apply. And here we go. Behar in a nutshell. Literally, Behar means in the mountain. And the Torah emphasizes that these laws were told to Moses at Mount Sinai. So that's the opening statement of the parsha. God spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai. So we'll read the nutshell. On the mountain of Sinai, God communicates to Moses the laws of the sabbatical year. Every seventh year, all work on the land shall cease, and its produce becomes free for the taking for all, man and beast. So the seventh year, you have a field, but you cannot claim ownership of your field. I mean, your field is yours maybe, but you can't, first of all, you can't work the land, but anybody can come in and take the produce of the field. If you have an orchard and the trees will produce fruit, so anybody can come and take it. You can't close off your field. So that's the sabbatical year. By the way, it's very important that we have the time to focus on this because this year in Israel happens to be a sabbatical year. So it's relevant and people are keeping this mitzvah today, right now, as we speak in Israel, at great personal sacrifice and cost. Okay. 7 sabbatical cycles are followed by a 50th year, the Jubilee year. Hebrew word is Yovel, which I think, well, at least one of the interpretations, the word Yovel means, it's another word for shofar, which is the horn that they would blow throughout the land to pronounce the freedom, as we'll read in a minute, on which work of the land ceases. All indentured servants are set free. And this is the most interesting feature of the Jubilee, and all ancestral estates in the Holy Land that have been sold revert to their original owners. So this is very interesting with great ramification. In biblical Israel, you cannot sell land, or you could sell land if all you want, but the land will go back to the original owner after the 50th year, during the 50th year, I should say, in the beginning of the 50th year. And it's called the Jubilee year because they would pronounce, it's not in a nutshell, but they would blow the shofar to pronounce the freedom of the servants to go home. There's a verse in this week's parsha which is inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. You can go see it, as I have a long time ago when I was in elementary school. But in any case, you could see that verse right there from Leviticus, where proclaim freedom throughout the land. Behar also contains additional laws governing the sale of lands and the prohibitions against fraud and usury. And this is the story in short. Of course, it does not capture everything that the parsha says, but some of the big ideas. So that is the introduction, the parsha in a nutshell. Okay, now the only question is where to begin from. So I guess you can't go wrong if we read a few verses in the Torah, we'll get the feel, and then we will talk about some of the details. Parsha text. Okay, so I'm going to read a few verses to we're going to get the feel of what the Torah is trying to convey. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, when you come to the land that I am giving you, the land shall rest a Shabbat to the Lord. You may sow your field for 6 years, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in its produce. By the way, it's very interesting that the Torah doesn't say you may. I mean, maybe it does say you may. That in Hebrew, the word tizra means plant. In biblical Hebrew, it's very hard to distinguish it's impossible to distinguish between may and shall. You shall sow your field, meaning you have to. So there's no way to know if it's a commandment or if it's permission to plant on the 6th year, during the 6 years. You have to understand it from the context. And that's why some opinions say that when the Torah says, not in this case, but when the Torah says you should work for 6 days, on the 7th day you rest, so work for the 6 days is a mitzvah. Because the Torah says you shall work. Doesn't mean you may work, or doesn't mean you have to work. So there's different opinions. So here's a similar thing with the 6 years. So they translate, you may sow your field. But again, in the Torah, it's tizra. It could be shall, just as easy. You may sow your field for 6 years, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in its produce. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a complete rest, the Shabbat to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor shall you prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest. Aftergrowth would be that sometimes in a field there were things were going to grow from last year's seeds if you're growing grain. So you're not allowed to reap it in the sense that you can't reap it and take it home. As we'll see in a minute, you could eat it, but you have to leave it for everybody. And middle of verse 5, and you shall not pick the grapes you have set aside for yourself. In other words, don't pick the grapes if you're considering it just for yourself. For it shall be a year of rest for the land. Who can eat it? Verse 6, and the produce of the Shabbat of the land shall be yours to eat for you, for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and resident who live with you, and for all of its produce may be eaten also by your domestic animals and by the beasts that are in your land. In other words, verse 5 may sound a little confusing. Verse 5 may sound you're not allowed to harvest and you're not allowed to pick the grapes. So you may think that it means that I'm not allowed to eat the grapes that grow in my field. So then verse 6 and 7 clarify, no, anybody, you can eat it, but it's for you, it's for your maidservant, it's for anybody else, any resident, for the animals. So now we go back to verse 5, and verse 5 means don't collect the aftergrowth of your harvest. In other words, don't consider it your harvest. So if you consider it exclusively yours, then you cannot use it. Then you can't take it. But you're certainly allowed to take it just like anybody else, right? But you can't take it all home and put it in your storage house. So that is the first mitzvah here, the mitzvah of what they call Shemitah. Literally means to let go. Lishmot is to let go and to let the land rest. And then verse 8, we begin to talk about the next mitzvah, which is the Jubilee, the Yovel. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's say a point or two on the Shemitah, and then we could continue. So just to think about the big ideas of the book. So one way to create order, there's so many commandments, how do you want to create order? One way to think about this, I may have said this in the past few weeks, but one way to think about this is that the book of Leviticus is all about holiness, achieving holiness. But then there's multiple dimensions of holiness. So we start with the holiness of people. We talk about the priests. A lot of here is about the priests, last week's Parsha. But in general, the holiness of coming close to God, a person coming close to God through the offerings. So basically sanctification of people, purity and impurity, how to make oneself pure. So I would say a good portion of the book, almost the whole book really, till last week, talks about the holiness of people. But then last week we introduced a new concept, that there's also a dimension of holiness that is, in addition to the holiness a person could achieve, there is also a dimension of time. Because last week we talked about the holidays, that's time. There are moments that are holy, times that are holy, set times of holiness. So the holiness affects not just people, but also the time. And what do we get in this week's Parsha and next week's Parsha? It's the holiness of space. There's a certain place that's holy. The land of Israel is holy. And that's why the sabbatical, to let the land rest, to let the land, the way the Torah refers to the rest is not just rest, it's Shabbat LaHashem, a rest to God. In other words, it's a spiritual thing. It's not just you're letting the land rest so the crop, so the earth, soil can recuperate and produce a better crop the next year, right? People do that all the time, but that's not a Shabbat to God. That's a Shabbat for the soil. So Shabbat to God, to say that the land is on that 7th year, the land becomes holy, and therefore we designate it to God, and that's specifically in Israel, because specifically in Israel has that holiness, and certainly the Jubilee is specifically in Israel. So now we talk about the dimension of holiness, not only in the person, not only in space, not only in time, but also in space. a physical space. And then when you finish the book of Leviticus, you're going to get all three dimensions. And of course, according to 20th century science, modern science, they're related. Time and space are related, and you need an observer. So that's time, space, and the human being. That's person, time, and space. And that goes back to one of the earliest books of the Kabbalah, probably the earliest book, the Book of Formation, that talks about these three dimensions and then how they interact. So we got a little mysticism for the Lag BaOmer. So wonderful. We did that. Good. So that is one point to talk about, sort of where this fits in the entire book. But now let's start getting into the details in order to start thinking about what is the value of Shemitah? What is the purpose of Shemitah? So it doesn't say why. The Torah doesn't say why this mitzvah is important. The Torah just says do it. And then we have to try to sort of reverse engineer and say, so what would be the purpose of the mitzvah? What effect does this have upon society? So the first thing we want to think about is practically Shemitah is a time for rest. If you live in an agricultural society, so that takes physical labor, and you're invested in the crop and agriculture, and you have to think about time to devote for spirituality. So you have one day a week, okay, Shabbat, but then you have a sabbatical every 7 years. You would have a full year to devote to spirituality. So even the farmers have time, which not even the farmers are vast, overwhelming majority of the population. Where it was in agriculture, then they have time to dedicate to spiritual matters. So that is the basic interpretation of what Shemitah is trying to achieve. But it's probably a little bit more than that. And to think about what the deeper dimension as well and what it does to a person is, we would have to go a little bit deeper. So the place to start would be to open up the parsha and see the introductory passage. So what's the introductory passage? And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, okay, on Mount Sinai. Why are you telling me that this occurred on Mount Sinai? There are 613 commandments of the Torah. None of them are introduced by the way, God spoke to Moshe. You know where he spoke to him? On Mount Sinai. Maybe the 10 commandments, it says that they were at Mount Sinai. But all the mitzvot were said at Sinai. Everything was told to Moses at Sinai. So why do you have to say this mitzvah? Does it say God spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai? And this is a question that the Medrash offers and Rashi addresses. I'm going to read the question, but I'm not going to read the answer. The answer that we want to get to is different than the answer Rashi is giving. But let's open Rashi. Says Rashi, what special relevance does the subject of Shemitah, the release of the fields in the 7th year, have with Mount Sinai? In Hebrew, the exact translation, Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. What does Shemitah, what does the sabbatical have to do with Mount Sinai? Now, it's very funny because this thing becomes a phrase even in modern Hebrew. And people who may not know the connotation of where this is taken from, because they don't study the Torah, unfortunately and sadly, you can have secular people asking a question. If you want to say, what has one thing to do with the other? You say, what is the difference? What is the connection between Shemitah and Mount Sinai? Now, they don't realize where this phrase emerges from, but it emerges from the rabbinic literature and it makes its way into modern Hebrew. So it's actually very cute. But in any case, that's the question. What is the connection between Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and Mount Sinai? All the mitzvot were set at Mount Sinai. Why do we emphasize that it's the Shemitah, that the sabbatical year, the commandment to let the land rest on the 7th year, was set at Mount Sinai? So there's all kinds of interpretations. Rashi has his own interpretation. I'm going to give you a Hasidic interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation is as follows. What's happening here, when the Jewish people are about to enter the land of Israel, is a historic shift. The Jewish people up to this point have never been in agriculture. They never, that's not the way they earned their living. In other words, if you look at the patriarchs and their children and the tribes of Israel, they were in the cattle business. In other words, they were sheep. They raised cattle. They were not in agriculture. And there is a very big difference in these two types of occupations. If you're raising sheep, if you're raising cattle, that leaves you with a lot of, it's not labor intensive, number one. And number two, it leaves you with a lot of free time. And it's a very spiritual occupation. When you get into agriculture, it's very labor intensive. It pulls you in. You have much less time for spirituality. You have much more incentive to, I hate to say this word, but I'll say it anyway, to exploit other people. In other words, you need other people helping you to work. And that's why if you look at history, slavery, they tell me that slavery develops together when agriculture develops, because you need the power to work the fields as opposed to cattle. You don't really need a lot of people. You can have I remember traveling in Israel in the West Bank, and you see a little Arab kid, 6 years old, running around with 300 sheep. It's not labor intensive in that same way. So there's a tremendous shift happening within the Jewish people. We're becoming a people of agriculture, where we're going to have to invest tremendous amount of time and energy and involvement in our physical occupation. So what does the Torah say? Torah says, remember, you have to understand what is your identity. See, you live in America and someone asks you, tell me something about yourself. So you say, I'm an accountant. Now, the problem is, I never asked you what you do for a living. I didn't ask you what you do for a living. You say, I'm a lawyer. You say, I'm a doctor. I'm an astronaut. But I didn't ask you what you do. I asked you who you are. And the problem is that a lot of people define themselves by their occupation. They define themselves by by their sort of physical occupation. And what the Torah is telling you is, what is one of the purposes of Shemitah? The purpose of the Shemitah is every 7 years you stop to get in touch with your true core. What is your true core? Your true core is that you're at Mount Sinai. You're connected to God. You're connected to the Torah. So yes, you have to work for 6 years because you have to raise the crop, and you have to live in the physical world, and you need to be able to survive and thrive and build a functioning economy and a beautiful land. Yes, that's all true, but that's not what defines you. What defines you is the fact that you are a spiritual entity, you're a holy person, that you are at Mount Sinai, and that's why you'll stop every 7 years to spend time and get in touch with the person you really are. So that's why it's important to emphasize that this mitzvah is at Mount Sinai, was set at Mount Sinai, because what the mitzvah is really doing is telling us the purpose of the mitzvah is to keep you connected to Sinai, to remind you of your own core identity, to remind you of who you really are. So that is the first point about just the first 2 words of the Torah, of the Parsha. God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, addressing the name of the Parsha, and that relates to the purpose of the mitzvah, because God wants us to remember that we are essentially people that stand at Sinai. We're essentially connected to the Torah. We also have an occupation, but it's not our core, that's not our identity. So then you need a time where you can express your true identity. That's the 7th year. So that's at least one of the reasons for the Shemitah year. So that's point number 1. Now we go to another point, sort of a related point. And this also, we have to pull up the verse, because it becomes a question when you look at the grammar of the verse. Well, not the grammar, the terms that the verse uses, which is a little bit strange. So, this is the verse. These are the verses. What does God say? Speak to the children of Israel, verse 2, and say to them, when you come to the land that I am giving you, the land shall rest a Shabbat to the Lord. What does this sound like? This sounds to me, it sounds like when you come into Israel, the first thing you do, the land rests. Verse 3 says, well, you may sow your field for 6 years, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in its produce. But on the 7th year, you shall have a complete rest, a Shabbat to the Lord. Okay? So verse 4 tells you that you rest on the 7th year. Verse 3 says you work for 6 years. But verse 2 says, as soon as you enter the land shall rest. Now that's what it sounds like. It sounds like you come into Israel and you rest. But that's actually not true. Because when they come into Israel, they wouldn't rest. You first have to work for 6 years, and then you can rest. How do you know that? Well, we know that that's the meaning of the verse, but you can also see it within the word itself. Because the definition of rest is rest from work, right? Lishbot, shvita, Shabbat is to stop doing something that you were already doing. So it's actually impossible to say, when you come to the land, you'll take a rest. Let the land rest. How am I letting the land rest? The land never worked. right? So that's why the law is, no, when you come into the land of Israel, first you work for 6 years and then you rest. You can't rest before you work. It's like a guy, he gets the job and on the first day he comes to the boss and says, I need a vacation. He says, hey, I need a rest. He says, what rest? You didn't work yet. How could you have a rest? If you say you got to go, you have somewhere you have to go to is a different story, but that's not rest. If you say you need rest, rest implies I had work and now I'm resting. I worked and now I rested. So that's why the verse actually means you come into the land of Israel, 6 days, 6 years you work, the 7th year you rest. Wonderful. But then the question becomes, why does the Torah make it sound like you're going to rest as soon as you walk in, if that's not the law? Go ahead, Warren, please.
Rabbi, my question is, at what point are you in the land of Israel? As I recall, the Tanakh, when the Jews entered the land of Israel, there was a period. It was a period of one battle after another.
Yes.
At what point is it for this purpose? At what point were the Hebrews deemed to have entered the land of Israel?
So we're talking from memory now, so I may be wrong. So don't. I may be wrong. I reserve the right to be wrong, if that makes sense. I think it was immediately, because there are certain mitzvot that the Torah says, like last week we had a mitzvah of the new grain, bringing the new grain to God, to the Torah, to the temple. There it says, when you will enter the land and settle in it, or it uses a term of settlement. And you have other mitzvot, like the mitzvah of the first fruit, bringing the first fruit to God, the Bikurim, in the book of Deuteronomy. It also says, when you will come B'Yerishta, you will inherit and settle in it. So when the Torah wants to say that the mitzvah does not apply until everybody settled the land, which historically it took 14 years. Historically, there was generally speaking, there were 7 years that it took to conquer the land. They didn't conquer the whole land, but the portions of the land that they conquered in the days of Joshua took 7 years. And then there's 7 years that they were engaged in dividing the land between the people. So it took a full 14 years for everybody to settle. But it happened gradually. If you read the book of Joshua, you see that some people conquered and got their land immediately. Tribe of Judah, tribe of Shimon, they were the first people to take possession of the land. So if I am not mistaken, this verse, because it doesn't say an expression of settling or inheriting, it just says when you kik tavo, when you will come, so the clock starts ticking right away. In other words, as soon as they would walk in, that's year 1. So that I think is the correct answer, but again, I reserve the right to be wrong. Now the question becomes, like I said, so why are we telling you to rest right away? Now we're not telling you to rest right away, but the verse is written in a way that would imply that you're resting right away. Okay, so here I have another Hasidic idea. Hasidic idea is really twofold. Number one is the point that related to what we said before. What's the purpose of work? You're going to work. Well, why am I going to work? So I'm going to work because I need to earn a living. Okay, well, why am I earning a living? So I can take care of my needs. Okay, but what's the purpose? Ultimately, you keep asking, what do I need this for? What's the purpose? And ultimately, the purpose is a spiritual purpose. The purpose is so I can fulfill God's purpose, so I can be connected to God. To do that, I have to earn a living. I have to pay my bills. I have to have a home. I have to have a place to be able to perform the commandments. That's all wonderful. But the goal is not the 6 years. The goal is year 7. Right? Some people, they mix up the means and the end. In other words, I go on vacation, so I should be able to be a better, so I should be able to function better when I go back to work. Okay, it's wonderful. But again, so what's your purpose? What's the goal? What's your ultimate goal is the question. And it's clear that what the Torah wants us to understand with the mitzvah of Shemitah is that the ultimate purpose is the Shabbat, is the connection to God. That we do. We do every 7 days, but we also do it for a full year in the sabbatical, in the year of Shemitah if I'm living in Israel. But we tell you immediately, understand your purpose. The purpose is not to work for 6 years. The purpose is Shabbat. So we start with the purpose in the beginning. Why? Because the Torah wants us to be cognizant of the purpose throughout the entire 6 years. And this is a very important lesson for even if you don't live in Israel, and no matter what you're doing, because when you get to the details of whatever you do, the details sometimes when the person does the details, the person can burn out, because what brings us motivation and what brings us excitement and what brings passion is the purpose of what, being cognizant of why am I doing this. But sometimes when I'm involved in the detail, I have to do this task. So a task, you don't sense the purpose within this task. And sort of this day or this task or this moment is separated from the big picture, from the idea, from why I'm here to begin with, from the purpose of what I'm trying to do. And the Kabbalah spends a lot of time talking about the idea that the best way to live is when the general idea, the purpose, the vision is present when you're within the detail. Right now, I have to do a specific task. I have to get into my car and sit in traffic so I can get to a location, so I could speak to somebody, et cetera, et cetera. Most of what we're doing is details that ultimately serve a bigger purpose, but that detail itself, you may not necessarily see the bigger purpose. The goal is to be able to see the bigger purpose within the details of every day. A person would do that, they would not burn out, because the purpose and the vision, that's where the pleasure lies. And when there's pleasure, there's passion and there's excitement and there's no burnout. The burnout becomes when I'm separate from my vision. And the vision is the purpose. In the language of the Kabbalah, it talks about the end is rooted in the beginning and the beginning is rooted in the end, in the sense that if you're at the end, you're in a very practical space right now, you have to be rooted in the beginning, you have to be rooted in the purpose. And that's what's happening here. The Torah is telling you, before the Torah tells you to go to work for 6 years, the Torah tells you, you should know. The purpose is Shabbat LaHashem, rest to God, holiness to God. You'll have time for holiness. That's the purpose. The way to achieve, the way you do that is 6 days you prepare, six years you do the work you prepare. You're involved in creating and building the society. That's wonderful. But that's not the purpose. The purpose is the 7th year. And the bigger idea is that you want to be cognizant of the purpose throughout the 6 years. That's why we put the purpose at the forefront, right? Some people, every organization has to have a mission statement, and some people print out the mission statement and put it on their desk, right? So you could say, well, you put it on your desk. You don't have to put it on the desk. Whatever the case is, you have to be cognizant of what my mission statement is. And the more connected I am to the statement, the more excited I am. Most Ashkenazic shuls would have at the chazan, with the chazan's podium, the leader of the congregation, the podium, there was a sign that said, quoted a verse from King David's Book of Psalms, Shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. I place God before me always. So if you're going to pray, you're going to leave the community, you should be cognizant that God is before you. But the Hasidim never put it on the wall, and they said it has to be etched not on the wood, but in your head. But you see what I'm saying? So whether you do write your mission statement on the wall or you don't write your mission statement on the wall, that's the detail. But the important thing is that you have to be in touch, because whatever you're doing, you want an example, you're raising children. Raising children is basically a series of tasks that actually each one to themselves could actually be a little bit annoying. I have a brother-in-law who says, let me see if I can get this right. Oh, yeah, this is the truth of raising children. Don't quote me on this. I'm going to turn off the recording. Did I record? I don't know if I'm recording. Yeah, I'm recording. So he says like this. He says, raising children is 10%, no, 90% picking up toys and 10% empty threats. That's what he says. That's the formula. But in any case, you get what I'm saying. You get what I'm saying, that it's very easy to burn out because the tasks don't seem that inspiring. But what's the purpose? If you have the vision and you understand what you're doing, you understand you're helping shape and form a human being, then every moment is an opportunity to express your vision. But to do that, you have to be cognizant of the purpose of why am I doing this? And it's a challenge to always to be cognizant of the general idea when you're within the details. And that is the notion of the counting, of starting, beginning. Initially, the Torah says, you'll come to the land. What are we doing here? We're going to do Shabbos. Yeah, but we're going to do Shabbos, we're going to do a sabbatical year. Yeah, but we're not doing the sabbatical year for another 7 years. Okay, for another 6 years, the 7th year. Yes, of course, we're not going to practically do the sabbatical for the next 7 years, till the year 7, because you can't rest unless you work. Nothing to celebrate unless you did something. Okay, fine. But we tell you the purpose right away. We want you to be cognizant of the purpose right away. So that's another point about the Shemitah, about the sabbatical year, and again explains why the Torah begins by starting with the end instead of starting with the beginning and saying you work for 6 years and then rest. No, it says you rest, and then it says work for 6 years and rest. So that is another point about the Shemitah. So much to say, but we cannot just lead everything for Shemitah. We got to get to the Jubilee. So I want to read a few more verses about the Jubilee, and then we get to the real excitement to try to picture what society would look like in biblical Israel and what this would do to people to have this awareness. So this is actually profound. So here we go. Verse 8. Once we count 7 years, by divine providence, after 7 years comes verse 8. Okay, so what happens? And you shall count for yourself 7 sabbatical years, 7 years, 7 times. And the days of the 7 sabbatical years shall amount to 49 years for you. So we're counting 49 years. What happens after the 49 years? You shall proclaim with the shofar blasts in the 7th month, on the 10th of the month, on the Day of Atonement, you shall sound the shofar throughout your land. So in other words, we get an exact date. The Jubilee year is the 50th year, as we'll see later explicitly in verse 11, but it says after 49 years, you wait for the 7th month. 7th month, we count months in Hebrew from Passover. So the 7th month is the month of Rosh Hashanah, month of the high holidays. And then on the 10th of the 7th month, and in case you're confused, the Torah tells you exactly when it is, but Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonement, you sound the shofar. We think of sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. We don't really sound the shofar of Yom Kippur. We sound the shofar of Yom Kippur after Yom Kippur, right? That's when the fast is over. But we don't sound the shofar on Yom Kippur. But there's a mitzvah to sound the shofar on the Jubilee year, 50th year. What happens in the 50th year? Verse 10, and you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom for slaves throughout the land, for all who live in it. It shall be a jubilee for you, and you shall return each man to his property, and you shall return each man to his family. So basically what happens is everybody returns to their property. So when Jewish people moved into Israel, everybody gets a portion of the land. You may get poor, you may get lazy, you may not work your land, you may fall into debt, you may have to sell your land. But on the 50th year, the land comes back to you. Or you go back to the land, I should say. You go back to the land. And then, and it's after we say that verse, right? So that's the verse that's inscribed on the Liberty Bell. It may be, the translation may be different, but it's proclaim freedom throughout the land for all its inhabitants, for all who live in it. Okay, next. 50th year. The 50th year also, we're not supposed to plant. In other words, it's basically two sabbatical years, one after the other. You can't do work on this 49th year because the 49th year is the 7th year. And then the 50th year, you can't do work either. So verse 11, the 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow, nor shall you reap. It's out as aftergrowth or pick its grapes that you had set aside for yourself. For it is a jubilee. It shall be holy for you. You shall eat its produce from the field. During the jubilee year, you shall return each man to his property. So that is the notion of the 50th year, the Jubilee. So it happens to be that today we don't have the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year does not apply. How do we know this? Because the Talmud teaches that the Jubilee only applies when all the inhabitants of Israel are in Israel. In other words, when everybody is in Israel and Israel is divided, all 12 tribes are in Israel, then the Jubilee year, the division, the land goes back to the original owners. But ever since about I think it's the 7th century before the Common Era, when 10 of the tribes were sent to exile and have been lost, so we don't have 12 tribes in Israel. So the land can't go back to the previous formation, to the previous division. In other words, the land is not really going back to its owner. So the Talmud says that it only applies when all of its inhabitants are on it. In other words, when all the tribes are in Israel. But now when 10 of the tribes are lost, the mitzvah of Yovel does not apply. If you want to see the verse where it's derived from, the verse 11 says, verse 10 says, and you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live in it. The Chol Yashveh, for all who live in it. The question is, why does it say freedom for all who live in it? Not all who live in it have been enslaved, right? In the bracket, it says for slaves, because it's explaining, freedom for the slaves. But that's not what it says. It says proclaim freedom for the land for all who live in it, for all its inhabitants. So the Talmud says that when the verse says for all its inhabitants, it's not telling you who gets the freedom. It's telling you when the freedom applies. The freedom applies when all its inhabitants are in the land of Israel. So that's just the technicality. Okay, fine. So the Jubilee doesn't apply today, but of course, the message of the Jubilee probably applies. So where do we see it in Jewish life today? So one point that the Kli Yakar says, one point is we actually see a similar pattern of counting 7 times 7 and sanctifying number 50. Where do we see that every year? We see that in our counting of the Omer from Passover, the lead up to Shavuot, to the holiday of weeks where we celebrate the giving of the Torah. As we read last week in the Torah, we count 7 weeks, 7 times 7, that's the 49 days. And then the 50th day is the giving of the Torah. Similar pattern, 40 of 7 years, 7 times 7, 50th year is holy. So that is an interesting pattern where, if you think about it, especially with the counting of the Omer, you have this contradiction. On one time it says, the verse says, count 49 days. And then another time it says, count 50 days. So are we counting 49 or are we counting 50, which is a problem? So the commentaries explain that 49, certainly the Kabbalistic commentaries, 49 represents everything a person can do on their own. 49 gates of wisdom, 49 gates of understanding. 49 represents what we can do on our own. We have 7 emotional attributes. Each one includes 7. So you get 49. When you refine yourself to the point, 49 is the most we can do. When we do what we can do, then God gives us the 50th. 50th gate is a gift. So just like the giving of a Torah, we prepare for the giving of a Torah, 49 days, and then the 50th day is when we get it, but we get it as a gift. But the gift is only given after we do what we can. And the same thing happens with the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year represents a freedom and a blessing that only God could grant us, but that comes after we go through the cycle of counting 7 years and 7 years and 7 sabbaticals. So that's a little bit about the Jubilee year. We want to talk about what the Jubilee year, the implications of the Jubilee year for the economy. We also want to talk about the implications of the Jubilee year in the spiritual sense, which definitely does apply today. So we'll do that. Hopefully we'll have a few minutes for that as well. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I had a question about what's written on the Liberty Bell. I don't think it says anything there about the 50th year. However, the verse says, you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom throughout your land. So is the Liberty Bell more right than this passage, or maybe the translation is wrong because it's all in one sentence?
Well, I think it's taking only a part of it. Let's find the inscription right now.
So my question is,
the Liberty Bell bears a timeless message: proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto the inhabitants thereof. So yes, it's a direct quote from our parsha. However, it's not a complete quote. And when you go to court, what do they tell you? Say the truth and the whole truth, because half a truth is not the truth. But yeah, they're doing. I guess the founding fathers wanted freedom throughout the land always.
Well, and so do we. So is it a translation? Is it, or this is only like in the context of
50th year you go freedom. 50th year you go freedom. In other words, part of freedom is allowing people to mess up. Okay, that's part of freedom, and then you revert back to freedom. Because if you force people, imagine there was a law that says we want to make sure everybody has wealth or everyone has assets. So we're making a law and no one's allowed to sell their ancestral land. Wonderful. What a beautiful law. You don't need the Jubilee. And then nobody will be poor, because however poor you are, you can always have real estate. You can always plant a potato and eat your potato, right? So isn't that a wonderful plan? Everybody has the land. We divide the land. By the way, it's not your land. By the way, God says it later in this parsha. God says you cannot sell the land forever. You know why? Because the land belongs to me. That's essentially what the Jubilee is saying. The Jubilee is saying it's not yours to sell. So I would say, if God wants everyone to have land and to have a connection to the land of Israel, say nobody could sell their land. Problem is, that's not freedom, right? Because freedom is the freedom to make mistakes, and you can buy, you can sell. We understand that there's value to commerce, and some people need cash, and some people want to sell some of the land to raise money to be able to whatever, do other things. It's all good and fine, but that's freedom. But the point here is freedom is the ability ultimately to revert back and say, after all my mistakes, I'm actually rooted in this place, and I don't have to pick up and leave, right? You have to understand, in ancient world today, you can leave Israel, come back to Israel, hop on a plane, go there for the high holidays. All you have to do is pay for an expensive bed and breakfast, Airbnb in Jerusalem. But in the ancient world, if you had no hope for the future, you would just pick up and leave, right? That when do people migrate? People migrated in the ancient world, first of all, never to go back. You migrate. When do you migrate? You migrate when you don't feel you have a future in this area, in this place. And when you migrate, it's a disconnection. You're never going back. So what would be if what is the Jubilee telling you? The Jubilee telling you is even if you made mistakes, economic mistakes, and even if you subjugated yourself and you get to the point of poverty and you have no future here, there's no reason to pack your bags and go to another country because you do have a future here. Because the cycle is not going to continue. At some point, you or your child or your grandchild up to 50 years are going to get the land back. And therefore, we tell you a place, this is who you are and this is where you belong. And that's the message of the Jubilee. And it's actually very interesting. When does the Jubilee apply? You would expect the Jubilee to be triggered in the beginning of the year or the end of the year. Jubilee year, beginning or the end. So the beginning. Rosh Hashanah should be the Jubilee. By the way, but anyway, sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, it's sufficient. When you blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, the Jubilee year happens. No. When does the Jubilee year get triggered? When does the freedom take force? When are the servants released and the land goes back to its original owner? We read it inside on Yom Kippur. Now, what is Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is a time of repentance. What is repentance? Teshuvah, return. Okay, so literally on Yom Kippur is a day of return. What does the verse say what does the verse say about the Jubilee? It uses the same term. It says, Vishavtem isha lachuzato, right? So he says, and you shall return each man to his property, and you shall return each man to his family. So Vishavtem, the idea of the root of Teshuvah of Yom Kippur is really the Jubilee is celebrated on Yom Kippur because Yom Kippur is the time when we come back to our true selves, when we go back to our family, we go back to our land. So on Yom Kippur, every year you go back to who you really are. It doesn't have the power to affect the economy. But in biblical Israel, the 50th year, the intense holiness, that truth, that all my mistakes are external and they don't define me, that truth actually affects the economic structure of society as well. And my mistakes that caused me to have to sell my land because I become poor. And later on in the parsha, you see other things. Ultimately, I sell myself as a slave because I need money, I need support. So these are all mistakes, but they're not my core. And Yom Kippur of the Jubilee is when I return to my core, and that returning to my core has the physical expression as well, has the economic expression as well. So that's why that's why I haven't seen it written explicitly, but to me it's so obvious. It says that same word, Vishavtem. You will return to your property, to your family. You'll return to the land of Israel. You return to your true self. That's the theme of the Jubilee, and that's the theme of Yom Kippur. And that's why the Jubilee on Yom Kippur is when the Jubilee is triggered. So one way to think about the Jubilee is to think about, spiritually speaking, I get to the point where I understand what's my identity and where my identity is and where my family is and where my future is. Now, the economic system that will allow for that is that I always have economic safety and security because ultimately I'm going to get my real estate back. If not me, my child, right? A lot of people, they immigrate. Why do they immigrate? I may have a better life where I am now, but I'm immigrating for my children. My children will have a better future. And again, it's not like today where you can always go back and you can come and you can go. Back then, if you left, you left. You're gone. You're not coming back, right? So what the Jubilee tells you is you're connected to the space. This is who you are. This is your identity. It also expresses itself in the economic system that will support for that. And also, you can also talk about the idea that is also economic. At some point, you have the balance. Okay, we're talking about the balance between capitalism and, I don't want to say socialism, but I would say ensuring the economic freedom for everybody. So which system are you going to take? And if you take capitalism to the extreme, it's very good because it creates innovation, et cetera, and it rewards creativity, et cetera. But at some point, some people are going to be left behind. And then, to quote our good friend Karl Marx, the people who control the land, everybody else will be subjugated. Okay, so where does the Torah stand on this question of capitalism versus socialism? And what the Torah is doing here with the Jubilee system, the Torah is basically saying both are true, both have a point. And that's why we allow for a capitalistic system where people could amass wealth and they can amass real estate, and you could theoretically own the entire Israel and everybody else is working for you, no problem. And you pay them. Okay, but at some point you want to reset. Now, there's certain places where you don't reset, a small city, so not every place resets. Manhattan Island, you'll see certain islands, you don't have to reset, you can invest your real estate there, and it's not going to have to go back. But those are pockets. And the Torah puts out those pockets in this parsha. It's absolutely fascinating. So you have those pockets where you can invest, and everybody's always going to want that piece of land, and the value is just going to go up and up and up, and it's going to be a bubble that never bursts. Okay, because it's such a limited space. But in general, outside those pockets, you're going to be able to, the land reverts back, and there's a reset. And a reset doesn't mean the wealthy have to give up their cash. The wealthy can keep their cash. They just can't keep their real estate. So I don't know why Karl Marx wrote what he did. I would say the Jubilee system is better than what he proposed, but I guess I don't know. Okay, that's just me. The Jubilee is all the land goes back to the land. I go back to my true self. So let's talk a few minutes about the spiritual notion of the Jubilee, spiritual freedom. According to the Kabbalah, so we have two modes of resting. We have, during the 6 years, a person is involved in the physical world, the physical ambition to be able to succeed and physically and financially and prosper. That's fine. 7th year, you rest, you dedicate to spirituality. 50th year is freedom. And we said freedom for all its inhabitants, but I was never enslaved, but it's freedom. So according to the Kabbalah, freedom, the state of the Jubilee is a state of mind. And in my spiritual service of God, I'm free. I'm free of subjugation to my negativity. And it's a deeper freedom than the sabbatical year. And basically what the Kabbalah says, Hasidic writings to elaborate upon this and explain this, is it's based on the Zohar. The Zohar says the 50th year, I mentioned the 49 steps that lead to 50th. According to the Kabbalah, the 49 steps are the emotions. And emotions, if you're in a state of emotions are subjective, so you're not really free because it's subjective. You're sort of trapped in the self. According to the Zohar, the 50th year, so it's Lag BaOmer, we have to talk about the Zohar. 50th year, the Zohar refers to as Alma Decheru, which is Aramaic for the world of freedom. And in the world of the Sfirot, it's the Sfirah of Bina, understanding, intelligence. Intelligence is supposed to is, unless it's co-opted by the emotion, intelligence is objective, and objectivity equals freedom. Right? So what is subjugation? Subjugation means I know this is bad for me, but I do it anyway because I want to, because I'm emotionally connected to this thing. But I know it's harmful for me, but I can't. My emotions are pulling me to it. That's subjugation. And that's 49 years. I'm sort of trying to refine myself. 50th year, and if I'm living in the realm of the mind, if I have the awareness of the mind, and if I know and my emotions have been refined, then if I know that this is bad for me, I'm free. I have no desire for that negativity because I'm in the world of Bina, I'm in the world of intelligence, I'm in the world of understanding, of enlightenment, where it's not about how I feel, it's about what is the truth. So that's Kabbalistic interpretation. Now let's bring it down a little bit from the Hasidic perspective. Hasidic perspective is you have what they call two ways where a person is going to connect to God. One is called itkafia. Itkafia means to subjugate self. One is itapcha, transformation of self. So what do I mean? So in simple English, it's like this. Itkafia, to subjugate self, means I do the right thing, but part of me doesn't want to, and I have to force myself to do the right thing. Right? So am I doing the right thing? Yes. Am I connected to holiness? Yes. Am I free? No. Because it's battle. So according to the Kabbalah, that's the 7th year. 7th year means I got to a state of holiness. I'm in a holy environment, but it's not battle-free. I'm not completely free. It takes effort and takes work, and part of me doesn't want to do it. It's an inner battle, is inner tension. The 50th year, you pronounce the shofar, you get to a space, the true core, where there's no inner tension at all. And here, there's a space within me that is so connected to doing what's right and good that I want to do it, and the distraction falls away because when I get in touch with my true core, that's what I want. I don't have to force myself to do the right thing. That's what the Kabbalah says, and the Kabbalah elaborates. And I don't, we could elaborate about this for a long time, but we have 2 minutes left. What am I going to do in the next 10 minutes? I'm going to show it to you where you see this in the verse, because everything in the spiritual ideas of the Torah have to find expression. So there's a beautiful proof, quote unquote proof within the verses that the 7th year, there's still a battle. 50th year, there's no inner spiritual battle. Where do you see that? We're talking about 50th year. The real estate goes away. Where do you see that the person has to still battle with self in the 7th year, but in the 50th year, the person does not have to. So let's go back to the verse. I'm going to share 1 or 2 verses, and then we're going to conclude and summarize, and everybody will be able to go back to their property and their estate and implement the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. Okay, here we go. Big question. Oh, no, no, verse, here we go. And the land will then yield its fruit, and you will eat to satiety and live upon it securely. Verse 20, and if you shall say, what will we eat in the 7th year? We will not sow, and we will not gather in our produce. What are you talking about, rest in the 7th year? How am I going to rest in the 7th year if I am not going to work? What does God say? Know then that I will command my blessing for you in the 6th year, and it will yield produce for 3 years. And you will sow the 8th year while still eating from the old crops until the 9th year. In other words, you really need 3 years, because in the 6th year, you have to produce for the 6th year, for the 7th year, and for the beginning of the 8th year until the new until the new crop can grow. So God says, oh, you're going to ask, what am I going to eat on the 7th year? Don't worry, in the 6th year, I'm going to command my blessing. You'll have grain for 3 years. Which, by the way, a very big, usually the land weakens at the 6th year, right? Before you let the land rest, every year it produces less and less because the soil has been deprived of nutrients. But let it rest, it can rejuvenate. But to say the last year will be the most productive is counterintuitive. Nobody would make a promise like that. Not even Moses. Only God could say that. But in any case, what do we see from here, says the Hasidic commentary? There's no question, no verse that says, and if you're going to say, what are we going to eat on the 50th year? 50th year, we didn't work the 49th year, or the 50th year, or the 51st year, because we can't eat until the grain is ready. There's no question that says, what am I going to eat in the 50th year? How come? How come there's no question? So this is proof to the Hasidic way of Hasidic perspective. The 7th year is you imposing the holiness, but you're not free. There's still tension. There's still questions. You're still wondering, am I going to suffer from following God's commandments? Am I not going to suffer from God's commandments? So you have to be reassured. But that's a tension, that's a battle. 50th year, same verse. It says you're not allowed to do work in the 50th year. But in the 50th year, there's no question, what am I going to eat? Because in the 50th year, you're so in touch with the reality that the blessing comes from God and the trust in God that you're not going to have the question at all. In other words, the 50th year is freedom for everybody because we're no longer subjugated to our own ego. In other words, what I'm basically trying to say in short for the past 61 minutes is that the laws of Shemitah, the Jubilee, and the Sabbatical and the Jubilee, even though practically they apply only in Israel, the 7th year, the Jubilee, the Sabbatical, and the Jubilee only applied in Israel when all the Jews lived there, they don't really apply anymore. But the message and the awareness of the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, that is applicable to us, especially in a sabbatical year, but in some sense, every year, because like I said, the idea of the 50th year, the freedom from the negativity that we actually have in our life every day, and certainly on Shavuot, as I mentioned in the beginning, at this 49 years and the 50th year correspond to the 49 days leading up to when we get the Torah. And we left Egypt, and we're trying to get the Torah, and we're struggling to refine ourselves. There's still battle. You get the Torah. If you could connect to the holiday of the giving of the Torah, if you could connect to the awareness of the Torah, then you're truly free, and you don't have any questions. You don't have any worries because you're freed from the inner tension and the inner difficulties. So this is the story in short. There's a lot more to say about the Jubilee in the economic sense, in the economic world it's trying to create, and in the spiritual sense. But for that, we'll have to come back next year and continue studying and elaborating in good health. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and see you next week, the last portion of the book of Leviticus. We got by the hardest book, I think. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
you.
you, Rabbi.